Hello everyone, welcome to the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad and the Chicago and Northwestern Railway in Wyoming. Today is June 3rd, 2024. This is layout update number 55. I'm Mark Pruitt, pipe fitter. April was another month completely consumed with staging yard construction. The yard itself is complete except for cabling back to the control panel, and the sub-road bed is installed from the layout to both ends. Some of the lead track still needs to be installed. The yard needs to be raised the last inch or two, then final adjustments for longitudinal and lateral alignment completed, and the entire control panel still needs to be built. A lot left to go. Let's go take a look. We left off in the last update at this point. Sub-road bed for the east staging lead was in from the switch at Powell towards a spot under Holly Sugar. Right after that update posted, I got cork cut and laid on the new line, then began laying track. By late on the 6th of May, I had sub-road bed installed all the way down the peninsula and around the curve to parallel the wall at the end. Cork was laid down to that curve. By the 8th, I had track laid almost to the end of the cork. Here we're looking back towards Powell from near the end of the cork on the lead. Then I got back to work on the east end of the yard itself. Here I was in the middle of building the yard throat. By the 9th, all the track work on the east yard section was done, which meant that all the track laying in the entire yard was complete. I spent the next few days installing the ear dots and tortoises on the east end of the yard and wiring it all up. On the 14th, Dave came down from Basin to help with the layout for the day. Here he is rapturously and enviously looking over the areas around Casper and the CNW up above. Or maybe he's just shaking his head at the whole mess. It's one or the other. If you recall, last time Dave was down on April 30th, we discovered the big problem with the east staging lead that drove the whole thing to be redesigned. I was sure hoping nothing else like that would turn up with this visit. We spent the entire day assembling the staging yard. I would have thought that would have gone pretty fast, but it took the two of us about 6 hours to complete the task. We're pretty slow, but at least no major flaws showed up this time. I was hoping the entire yard would be strong and rigid enough along its length that I could lift it into position as a single unit. I didn't expect that to be the case though, and sure enough, it wasn't. So I spent a couple of days mulling over how to raise and support the yard. What I finally came up with meant I had to disconnect the yard sections from each other again. So much for most of the work Dave and I did. Starting with the east end of the yard, I lifted each section up and set it on stacked up plastic bins. By late on the 16th, I had everything lifted up onto bins and all the sections reconnected together. Now phase 2 of raising and supporting the yard could commence. I decided to support the entire yard off the Casper benchwork above using threaded rods. I have tons of that stuff left over from my giant helix on version 2 of the layout, so why not use it? I spent the 17th fabricating the support pieces and began installing them on the 18th. The mounting block at the top is screwed to joists on the grid sections of Casper's benchwork, with the rod hanging down from there. By the end of the day, I had several of the suspension frames installed and the plastic bins removed. On the 19th, I finished the suspension rods. Here we're looking down the length of the entire yard from the west end. Because the east end of the yard extends a couple inches beyond the front of the Powder River benchwork, the threaded rod suspension system won't work there. For now, the yard in that area is supported on step stools and automotive jacks. The permanent supports will be legs. On the 20th, I went back and installed the re-railers at all section joints. That's a total of 18 re-railers. At this point, it was time to test all the yard tracks. I connected alligator clips between the Powder River siding and one of the yard feeder connections, put a 10-wheeler on the first track, and away I went. I ran the loco up and down the length of every track. Even though power was being fed only at the east end feeder connection, there were no power issues anywhere along the yard. I half expected to find a re-railer joint where I'd missed a rail base with a joiner, but everything was good. I should go buy a lottery ticket. I didn't run the loco through the turnouts, since there was no track beyond the first turnout in the throats. I'll just cross my fingers and hope they're all okay when I start running trains through them. I hope I'm not sorry about that. For the next couple of days, I attached electrical cables and bus lines to the barrier strips on the sides of the yard. I started with the west end ear dot connections. That took more time than I expected. Doesn't everything? But on the 23rd, I finished the west end connections and worked my way down to the second set of ear dots in the center of the yard. I didn't do the east end of the yard, since that will be easy to get to even after the yard is raised into final position. On the 24th, I cranked the yard up a couple inches just to make sure it would work. To do this, I laid on my automotive creeper and rolled around under the yard, raising each support by about 1/3 of an inch at a time using a box end wrench. I turned each nut 6 turns, then moved on to the next one. That's loads of fun. At my age, using a creeper isn't easy, but the hardest part was getting onto and off the thing. As I get older, the floor seems to just get farther and farther away. The next day I stopped raising the yard, as I needed to attach the west staging lead and track before raising it to final position. Adding the track after the yard was raised would have been really difficult. First thing I did was add the splice that will carry the track from the lead onto the yard benchwork. You can see how the end of the yard sub-roadbed is off the framework just a bit. That was intentional. The grade down into staging from that end eases out to flat across the yard throat. In this picture from a few days earlier, you can see the end of the west lead over the yard. The yard will have to be raised up to that level, but obviously the lead is too long. It was installed in late 2023, and I figured then I would have to trim it a bit when I got the yard done. Now it was time. I had to disassemble a bit of the benchwork between Casper and Douglas to get to the staging yard lead against the wall to cut it. Once cut, I removed the entire section under Casper Yard. About half the straight section on the right end had to be removed to fit the lead to the yard. On the 26th, I attached the now truncated lead to the yard. I sighted down the lead and yard tracks to make sure everything was aligned. That would have been very hard to get right if the yard was up in its final position. Then I added the re-railer, completing the connection of the yard lead to the yard. Except for the other end that I had cut, that is. That would have to wait until I got the yard closer to its final elevation under Casper. Then it was back onto that consarned creeper. Over the next couple of days, I spent several hours on it, raising the yard about 8 inches. It's now within an inch or so of its final height, and that was close enough to reattach the sub-road bed at the wall between Casper and Douglas. Look! It actually lines up with the older part of the benchwork. How lucky can a guy get? That short section of missing track still isn't there. I'll add that in the next day or two, after the east lead is done and the yard is raised the last little bit. Once the west end staging connection was done, I turned my attention to the east end. You may not have noticed, but I'd added the curved lead at the east end of the yard shortly after I lifted the first yard section off the floor. Working my way from the Powell end of the lead, I installed the sub-road bed that runs right against the wall between Thermopolis and Worland, then started working on installing the pieces that run under Wind River Canyon. I neglected to get any shots of the sub-road bed under the canyon, but you'll see how it looks in a few seconds. Meanwhile, with only the straight section left to install under Showbahn, I measured, then trimmed away the excess length of the curved sub-roadbed. Like pretty much everything else associated with the staging yard, trimming the sub-roadbed was a bit of a pain. I used a pole saw, since there wasn't room to fit a jig saw or circular saw under there, and I was very careful not to angle the saw to avoid gouging the drywall just an inch or two away. On the last day of May, I cut roadbed strips and glued them into place on the now completed sub-roadbed. This last shot shows what the line looks like under the canyon. Obviously, the sub-roadbed isn't on its supports yet, but those will come after I have the yard in final position and am able to set a smooth grade along the entire lead. On June 1st, I started laying additional track on the east staging lead. Yesterday, I finished laying the track to the east end staging yard. Now all I have left to do is that short section of track in the west staging lead. Which brings us to the end. Today or tomorrow, I'll install that one last bit of missing track in the west staging lead. Then I'll run a locomotive up and down the east lead a few times to make sure the track there is up to spec. After that, it will be time to raise the staging yard to final position and set the grades on the east and west leads. Then will come refitting the old control panel for the new yard. I've got an operating session scheduled for June 25th, so about the 20th I'll have to stop work on the layout and make preparations for that. The train room is a total wreck right now, and it's going to take a couple of days to clean up. If anyone plans to be in the vicinity of Casper, Wyoming that day, drop me a note if you'd like to participate in the session. As always these days, don't forget the Cronkite segment right after this. Thanks for watching, everyone. Stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you next month. In late 1986, on Halloween in fact, I went to work for the Boeing Company in Seattle, Washington. Looking back all these years later, that date seems very appropriate, but that's another discussion. My not really wife Debbie, and that's also another discussion, and I, along with her 2 young children, moved into a small house in Covington, Washington, just east of Kent. Within just a few months, in early 1987, I started construction of a new layout in the garage. The track plan was almost identical to the one from a couple years earlier in California. Construction was slow, what with work and a family, but there was progress. These were my Great Northern Big Sky Blue years. Not a steamer in sight. I was young and dumb. Then in late 1987, an opportunity to purchase our own home presented itself, and we couldn't turn it down. That didn't end the layout, though. This one would be moved from the rental to the new house a few blocks away. And that's the way it was, all too briefly, in 1987.